very pleased indeed when Beth and her friends came to ask me to do this talk tonight, because I think it's something that I'm certainly very passionate about, and I think it's something that does need illumination. It does need illumination because we're in a situation now in the world where there are perhaps 90 million people who, for no fault of their own, have been forced to leave their homes, to leave their communities, to leave their culture, to leave their countries. And quite frankly, the world isn't dealing with it very well. And in particular, sorry, I don't have Brad's voice, sorry. In particular, Australia is not dealing with it very well at all. So what I want to do, very briefly, and there's such a lot to say about this question in such a short time, but in a very brief period, what I want to do is to talk about a situation that refugees find themselves in and what perhaps we even might be able to do about it. And I want to start by talking about a boat of refugees, but not a recent boat and not a boat that was coming to Australia. This is the MV St. Louis, which in May 1939 left Hamburg harbour in Germany with 937 Jewish asylum seekers. Now, these, to be frank, were people who were probably better off than the average person in Germany. They were able to afford a passage on a steamship. They were able to afford to buy a visa, in this case to Cuba. And the St. Louis steamed into Havana Harbour with the hope that those people could escape what was to become a horrific period in human history, the Holocaust. They got to Havana Harbour, and the Cuban government decided not to let them in because it thought if it did, then thousands more would follow. And so they were forced to leave Cuba, to forget the visas, and the captain took his ship, the St. Louis, to Florida to ask for asylum in the United States. There were many representations to the US government to let them in, to Roosevelt's government at the time, but the US government refused this on the grounds that if they let them in, even more would come. And the captain, therefore, was forced to steam up the east coast of the United States. He even did something, or contemplated something, that ship's captains are very unlikely, very reluctant to do, and that was to wreck his ship by driving it ashore in order to force the issue. But the Coast Guard shepherded him away from the coast, and he had to keep going up to Canada, where again he tried to land his passengers, and again the Canadian government refused on the same grounds. He was forced to go back across the Atlantic, and some people were taken by Britain, but 619 of them were not, and therefore he was forced to go to the continent and land his passengers in France, Belgium, and Holland. And we know what happened next in the war. In France, Belgium, and Holland, they were occupied by Nazi Germany. And we know for sure from the records that at least 254 of those people were murdered in the Holocaust to follow. As a result of a story like that and thousands of other stories, where so many people were attempting to flee and find safety, to find refuge, but did not and could not, that countries around the world came together in 1951 to set up a thing called the International Refugee Convention. Now, the point of that convention was to say that refugees find themselves in different circumstances from other people who just want to travel. People who want to move for economic reasons, for work, for whatever reason, for business, for tourism, and so on. The norm for refugees, the normal situation, is that you cannot simply apply beforehand and travel and ask for refuge. You cannot, if you're a member of the, say, persecuted Hazara minority in Afghanistan, go to the Taliban government and say, look, I've thought about it. I think you're a terrible government, and I want to get out of here. Can you please provide me with the necessary documents? I need a passport, etc., etc. You can't go to places that they're trying to flee and travel in the normal way. And the convention recognised that. It also recognised that it didn't matter if you were applying for asylum, how you get there, whether you tramp across a muddy border in the middle of the night, or whether you stow away in a container across the English Channel, or whether you come in a flimsy boat across dangerous seas to the north of Australia, you should still have the right to apply for asylum. Not necessarily to get it, but at least to be judged whether you have a valid claim for asylum. That was the 51 Convention, and Australia abided by that convention. It signed it in 1954 and was pretty much a model international citizen in terms of its treatment of refugees in the post-war period. Particularly in the 1970s. After the fall of Saigon in 1975, the first boat arrived in Darwin Harbour from Vietnam. And in that period, after 1976, up to 1983, we granted about 100,000 refugee visas, almost entirely to Indo-Chinese refugees. And in that period, only 60 boats and a bit over 2,000 people arrived in those boats. What happened to the other 98%? How did they actually get here? They got here like this. They were flown here by Australian officials who had processed their applications in the countries that they had got to. Countries such as, particularly in this case, Malaysia and Thailand. And Australian immigration officials went to those places, interviewed the people, assessed their claims for asylum, and if they were successful, they flew them here. 98% of them, they flew them here safely. To my knowledge, not a single person died on a boat on the trip to Australia. People died from Vietnam to elsewhere, but not on the trip to Australia. So we were good citizens at the time. And in fact, this is an image from the front cover of a book that a friend of mine, a colleague at the University of New South Wales, Claire Higgins, has published recently. It's called Seeking Asylum by Boat. It's a fantastic book because it looks at this period between 1976 and 1983, and she's uncovered the records from inside the Department of Immigration. And she's uncovered comments made by the senior officials and advice given to the minister of the time and so on. It's really interesting because there are things in it like public servants, as they often do, outline briefing papers with lists of possibilities, not necessarily recommendation, but lists of options for ministers and even before that for the head of department to consider. So she's got these briefing papers with these options, and some of the options are things like, we could set up camps to imprison the boat people in remote locations. And there were handwritten notes alongside it. That would be barbaric. We couldn't possibly do that. One of the options was we could set up camps in third countries and send the boat people there. Note alongside, this would have terrible and harmful effects on the refugees. This would destroy our international reputation for generosity and humanity. We even get comments issued by the Department of Immigration at the time, press releases, which praise the boat people for their courage and perseverance, which say that they've done amazing things. Only a couple of kilos of rice and this void. Can you imagine our department today or for years praising these people for their courage and their resilience, actually creating public sympathy for them? That was then. That's not now. Because that started to change dramatically. In 1992, for the very first time, the government decided, in response to the arrival of a very small group of boat people from Cambodia, as it turned out, about 200, just over 200 people, that it was going to change the whole policy and institute a policy of mandatory detention. That meant no matter what your claim, you were locked up when you arrived. And increasingly, you were locked up in places like Woomera, remote locations away from any support that you could possibly get. You weren't allowed to go out. This wasn't the case ever before. In fact, I know people who in the 1970s and early 1980s came by boat and ended up in what were then called migrant hostels. And they look back at them and with great affection. They were able to stay there. They had somewhere to stay in the short term. They had English lessons. The kids went to the local schools. It wasn't a detention centre. Nowadays, they are. Nowadays, they're surrounded by barbed wire. Mandatory detention began under a Labor government. This is not a partisan question. It was the Keating government which instituted it. In 2001, John Howard was facing an election that was going to be very tough for him to win at first, and a boat called the MV Tampa, a Norwegian freighter, in the Sunda Strait, north of Australia, picked up 353 mostly Hazara asylum seekers from a boat that was floundering, and took them aboard and did what ships captains are supposed to do according to the law of the sea, and that is to take them to the nearest port, which was an Australian port and was Christmas Island. This is in the immediate period before an election campaign, and John Howard took the extraordinary step of sending SAS commandos, flying them to Christmas Island, and then to grapple onto the boat to take command of the boat to prevent that boat landing its people, the people on it, in Australia. And of course, he made the famous, maybe infamous statement at the election policy launch that year that we decide who comes to this country and the manner in which they come. The 1951 convention is being ripped up audibly right then and there, and Australia's performance about refugees and its reputation is changing. And he does something else that no other country had done, and no other country has yet done, unless Britain signs a deal with Rwanda that you might have heard about. No other country has sent refugees seeking asylum to us, with us, to third countries. He negotiated with Papua New Guinea to open the Manus Island and with Nauru to open the Nauru detention centres. And 3,125 people over the next period were sent there. And some of them were there for years. 9 years, I think, is the longest so far. In July 2013, again facing a very perilous election, the Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, decided that that wasn't enough, and that what would happen now is that anyone who had attempted to get to Australia by boat would be permanently excluded. These people have been found to be refugees. These people are found to deserve protection, but they would be permanently excluded from settling in Australia. Again, no other country had done that at this time. And honouring, I use the word in inverted commas, his election commitment, the new Prime Minister following that election, Tony Abbott, instituted the policy of boat turnbacks. When you look at those dates, they're pretty much a list of dates of Australian elections. In 1992, Keating looked like losing the 93 election. 2001, Howard was in trouble. 2013, Rudd was in very deep trouble, and Abbott was battling in that election to make asylum seekers a major issue. Domestic politics had actually come now to overwhelm international obligations that we'd had and that we'd honoured in the past. Why? Why this change? I've published a few things about this, and I think what we see in the 1970s and the 1980s, quite dramatically, is a collision of two series of changes that are taking place at the same time. Remember, this is a country that had a White Australia policy until 1966, and in reality didn't end the White Australia policy until the early 1970s, the first half of the 1970s. It was an affront in the 1960s. I remember growing up as a small child there to hear a language other than English being spoken in the street. this had really changed. And so places like, that's Main Street of Cabramatta in the 60s, within a few decades, started to look like this. Asian immigrants had begun to come into the country, and particularly Vietnamese immigrants following 1976. That's Cabramatta High in the early 1960s, and that's the same school a couple of decades later. It's massive cultural change. On the background of white Australia, this made a section of the population extremely uneasy about these cultural changes. Most of us liked it. A section of the population definitely didn't. And the second big change is we see the end of economic certainty for a whole slab of the population. This is just a graph of the unemployment rate. You see, from the early 1970s, it's practically impossible not to get a job. Then we have the recession of 73, 74, one in 80, 81, and one in 90, 91. 91 is the worst since the Great Depression. People are uncertain now. They're precarious. They're insecure. And it's accompanied by a whole series of other things. The end of the notion of a job for life, outsourcing, casualisation of labour, neoliberal economic policies being instituted from the 1980s by the Hawke-Keating government, and so on. And this makes people uneasy. The two things now can be combined, and they began to be in the 80s. This is a character called Geoffrey Blainey, who was an historian and a fairly prominent public intellectual. In 1984, he published a book and began to do a series of lectures and write for newspapers. The book and his lectures argued that Asian immigration was transforming Australia in a way that had to be stopped. He argued, he was a bit of an empire loyalist, that the crimson thread of kinship with Britain was being cut by Asian immigration and that it had to end. In other words, we had to go back to a racially discriminatory immigration program. And this got support. For example, Ida Buttrose, then the editor of the Sun Herald, said a European-based Christian society could change to an Asian-based one. So we start to see a shift back away from that great cultural demographic change that had taken place earlier. And in 1988, guess who dips his toe in this water? Can you guess? In 1988, facing an election, facing a still very popular Labor government, and as you can see, he wasn't very popular. That's a bulletin. The bulletin was be sympathetic generally to his party. He says that, yes, maybe Asian immigration should be slowed down a little. The first time that a leader had argued for a racially discriminatory immigration program since the 1960s. This was a huge change. But, you know, he benefited to a certain extent out of that. He did pick up some votes, although he lost the election again in 1988. But you know what? There's one section of the community that really hated it and reacted very strongly. Business. Business absolutely hated that idea because what Howard was doing was undermining two fundamental things that they were trying to do in Australia at the time. One was maintain a high level of immigration because half of Australia's economic growth relied on immigration, and that wasn't going to come from Britain. The second thing was he was attacking Asian immigration when the whole of Australian business had shifted towards trade and investment with Asia. You couldn't sit around a business table with Asian leaders and argue for investment and trade with them while you're discriminating against them racially in immigration policy. So Howard got a huge backlash, and it's one of the reasons why he lost the leadership to Andrew Peacock the following year in 1989. Now, politicians, I think, in Australia learned a lesson from this. They learned that if you're trying to find populist issues on which to gain votes, to play politics. You can't do it on immigration as a whole, and you can't do it on Asian immigration in particular. But guess who you could play those populist, racist politics with? Refugees, because they're economically insignificant. 5, at the very most, 10% of the immigration intake at the height. So you could stoke fears. You could post the refugees as a threat to our country, to our way of life. Illegal queue jumpers, potentially terrorists, strange Muslims who we don't understand. And therefore, what we see, go back a bit. Therefore, what we see are all of these changes in policy which have harmed people enormously. But every medical organisation in Australia that's had anything to do with Australia's refugee policy on Manus, Nauru or onshore has condemned these policies. There have been enormous health effects for those who've been subjected to them. 30,000 people are in Australia at the moment on temporary visas as a result of them with no permanency. Can't really start their lives. Can't actually go to university even. And some, that's been the case for 10 years. Others have been offshore for 8, 9 more years. But I want to pose an alternative and maybe a little bit of an optimistic one now. What if we tripled our intake of refugees? Last year, the intake was supposed to be 13,750. We didn't get anything like that number of refugees last year. But let's say we took it up to 40,000. What would it mean? I'm at the ANU. And if we did so, what we would get is an extra, I can't see it, but it's 30-something extra students. I hate to disillusion anyone who's going to university next year, but I'm afraid some tutorials are getting up to that sort of level. So an extra tutorial, we wouldn't notice it. If the Brumbies do incredibly well and get a home final across the way here, at full capacity, that would mean, assuming that the refugees like rugby at the same rate as everyone else, which of course I think would be the case, that would mean an extra 41.6 people. And Radford, if they go to Radford at the same rate, it would mean an extra 4 people. In other words, we wouldn't actually notice it in reality. And we could go back to what we were doing when we were still regarded as a good international citizen. We could go back to processing applications for refugee status in the places where they've got to. For us, that is particularly Indonesia, where we process no applications at the moment and haven't done for years. We could stop dangerous boat journeys by doing that, and also by diverting some of the obscene amounts of money that are being spent on detaining refugees into actually making their lives a little better in the places where they've got to. At the height, we were spending $3.2 billion per year on detaining people offshore alone. And that doesn't count the costs of the Navy. 3.2 billion. Put that in perspective, our foreign aid budget was 3.8 billion. Put it in perspective further, what that would mean would be an extra 4 teachers for every school in Australia. That's what we're spending on offshore detention. Diverting some of that money to making these people's lives better while we process applications would restore, I think, many of our faith in Australian society. So there is possibilities for change here, I think. I'm an academic, and quite often that term is used to suggest that you're remote from the world. You're in the ivory tower. But actually, I can't see any point in having the freedoms and the so on of academia unless you're actually trying to do something about the world to make it better. And if you too want to do something about it, talk to me afterwards, because whatever time and whatever talents you have to contribute to that effort, they will be welcome. Thank you.